Good morning. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respect the histories, languages, cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Welcome everyone to our third annual International Women's Day event. We are so pleased to again be partnering with Aimco on this event. I'm Kyle Murray. I'm the Vice Dean of the Alberta School of Business at the University of Alberta. Both of our organizations believe in the power of diversity. We know the business case for diversity has been proven time and time again. Diversity of thought leads to better decision-making, fosters innovative thinking, considers broad stakeholder perspectives, and results in a better culture. But this isn't just about being good for business. It's about uplifting our society, uplifting the whole people. Today, we shine a light on the merits of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. However, while progress is being made, we know we have much further to go when it comes to issues like narrowing the gender wage gap and increasing economic opportunities for women. One example comes from a poll that came out today from Leger Marketing, which found that only 21% of Canadian women believe gender equality has been achieved. And 73% of women believe that men earn more for the same job. There is work to be done. The University of Alberta is committed to creating opportunities for women to pursue careers in business and STEM, but this is a challenge that will require all of us to pull together. And this is why we're here today, to take another step in the right direction through an exchange of ideas and to celebrate the progress we've made so far. As part of that celebration, I would like to now introduce Nisha Patel. Nisha is an alumna of the School of Business BCom program, and we are very proud of her. She's an award-winning Indo-Canadian poet. She is the 2019 Canadian Individual Slam Champion, Edmonton Slam Champion, and a recipient of the Edmonton Artists Trust Fund Award. Nisha is the Executive Director of the Edmonton Poetry Festival, and she's performed across Canada and around the world, from Glasgow and Berlin to Seoul, Korea. Her poetry is very relevant to our topic today and speaks to themes of race, feminism, and identity. Nisha is Edmonton's 8th Poet Laureate and will deliver a spoken word version of a poem she wrote in honor of International Women's Day 2021. Please welcome Nisha Patel.
Hi, I'm excited to be here at International Women's Day. My first Women's Day celebration with the city was 2 years ago. And so for me to be able to come back here in my second term as Poet Laureate is something that is very deep and personal to me. And also to be here on behalf of the School of Business, with whom I, spent a lot of ups and downs with has been a really big privilege. So this poem is called "The Land is a Woman." They told me the land was a woman, her breath lives and dies with the bees. Will we protect her from the concrete's collapse or plant flowers to see her freed? Does the earth know what we've done and what we have witnessed in her name, the towers we've raised over earthquakes, the lakes and the wetlands we've drained? Every day we wake to the whooping crane's silence. The wolf loses his path next to gravel. The footsteps of caribou struggle to recreate good in the mountain's shadows. And as the ocean acidifies around us, it is the beluga's call that sounds, asking us to look for answers deep within ourselves. Do I have what it takes to be a woman in this age? Watch my sisters burn at the stake of men's impatience and rage? Or is the struggle different still? The serpentine whisper in my ears that despite all we achieve in spirit, we're weeping willows, grieving each other's tears. You see, every day that I awaken, I do not choose violence, but I inherit it all the same. For every man looking down his nose at me, there's a long line of women to whom we owe society's change. So when we shout for women's rights, the call is not for us to rise and fight the cowards. The responsibility is on those who fear us to put to work and use their power. The world is not starving for lack. We know the solutions are being achieved each day. Hunger and longing, war and politics, women are fighting for us all the way. But as we head movements and take up the mantle of preserving dreams for future's children, we are faced with resistance and denialism, subject to the mobs of violence again and again. And in my ancestors' village, there is a woman who makes 3 meals stretch to 6. Across continents, the imagination of another turns plastic into recycled bricks. Girls brave gunfire, rape, and greed on the long march for education. An autistic teenager crosses the Atlantic, infuriating an entire nation. Students fly to a cold prairie and take up residence amongst the snow. Women leave homes and friends and siblings, raising themselves when their fathers grow old. But I don't believe that we're far from the future that we deserve. I celebrate the brave and resilient ones, wrought in the fires of vision and nerve. And I am proud to announce that I know only unkind women, those who speak truth instead of niceties, the ones who hold anger as fuel for resistance. So are your ears burning just a little? Or are you ready to burn the system to the ground? If you're still waiting for a signal in the sky, look first at your daughters and mothers and make us proud. Say equity like you mean it. Bring us more than a seat at the table. Take your privileges to the bank, put money in the hands of the people. A single woman with resources is an ecosystem, has the power to regrow and transform the world around her. Get us out of poverty and clear-cut forests, bet on us and what we have to offer. Women are not cures or antidotes for a society that grows sour. We are resolutions, we are miracles, we are hope in the darkest hour. Dear woman, I see you, standing in your grief and your power. Take the hands reaching out to meet you, and together we'll reclaim what's ours. Thank you.
Nisha, that was phenomenal. It's my turn to speak, but I would much prefer to sit here for a moment and let those words reverberate, let my ears truly burn. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Kevin Ubeline. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Alberta Investment Management Corporation, or Aimco. Aimco is a Crown corporation and an institutional investor based here in Edmonton. Welcome to this 3rd annual International Women's Day public event. This year's theme, not just here in Edmonton, but around the world, is Choose to Challenge. Today is about celebrating women's achievements, but it's also about making an active choice to challenge ourselves, to challenge the organizations where we work, to challenge us to call out gender bias and inequality, and also to challenge what we individually have been thinking, what we've been saying, and what we've been doing in the past, and to choose to challenge ourselves to think differently and to do more. We're delighted also to be partnering with the Alberta School of Business for this year's event, and we're glad that each and every one of you could join us today for this important conversation. Over the past few years, progress has been made on diversity globally. However, we all know that challenges still remain, and we don't have to look globally to find the need to do more. Those opportunities are right here in our own companies, in our own city, and in this province. The challenges are complex, which lends itself further to the need for collaboration. And together we can help create a more inclusive world. And that is exactly why we're here today, to hopefully help move the needle in the right direction. Before I introduce today's moderator, just a few housekeeping points. I want to invite all of you to submit your questions for the panelists using the Q&A function that should be open right now and will remain open throughout the panel discussion. We also want all of you to respond to the survey questions. They will pop up so you can see them. And we want to get a snapshot of your position and your feelings on several important topics. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator, Amy Hepburn. Amy Hepburn is the Chief Executive Officer of the Investors Leadership Network. The Investor Leadership Network, or ILN, is an open and collaborative platform for leading investors who are interested in addressing sustainability and long-term growth. Aimco actually is one of the founding members of the ILN, and as a result, I've had the real pleasure of working closely with Amy. Amy is a globally recognized expert on social impact and a seasoned strategic advisor with deep expertise on gender lens social investments and designing unique public-private partnerships for high impact social return. Amy was a delegate on the first G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council created by Prime Minister Trudeau, and she is an active member of the Global Women's Forum on Economy and Society. She has faculty appointments at Duke University and George Washington University, where she teaches on social impact, gender equality, the care of children in crises, human rights, and humanitarian action. Please join me in welcoming Amy Hepburn. Amy, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you see me here? I don't know if you can. Can you all see me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, you can.
You look great.
Good, good. I can't see myself, so that's what makes it a little off for some reason on this scene. But anyway, Kevin, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and a happy International Women's Day to every single one of you who have come onto this call. It is a sincere pleasure to be able to moderate this conversation. As Kevin suggested, my work with the Investor Leadership Network focuses on convening global investors around the key issues for long-term growth and sustainability, and diversity is absolutely at the center of what we do. And Aimco in particular has been a real leader in helping us think through these issues. So again, my pleasure to be here today. As we know, advancing diversity is a journey. My career has been focused on this for the last 2 decades, and it is exciting to see the progress that's been made. And it is it's really important that we have opportunities like today to discuss the challenges that we're still working to overcome in really honest and thoughtful ways. Today, we're going to touch on some, the emerging trends, the best practices, and our best ideas with this prestigious panel on how we can lead inclusively. As has been stated by both Kevin and Kyle, there is a real business case for diversity, but I want to take this time with our panel to help tease it out a little bit more. Let's understand it better from a cross-sectoral perspective. We'll have an academic perspective with Michelle. We will have a corporate perspective with Angela, and we will have a public sector perspective with Mayor Iveson. So I'm very excited for us to get into our panel, but before we do, just a few housekeeping things to talk about here that Kevin already stated. Please take advantage of this Q&A chat. We want this to feel, we all miss the opportunity to be together. And so in this virtual world, we're trying to make this feel as intimate as possible. So take advantage of the Q&A chat, submit your questions. I will try to get to as many as I can as we go through our conversation. I also would like to take this opportunity for us to do a little opportunity to get to know the audience. And so we're going to have 3 questions that we're going to pull the audience to have us better understand, the panelists and myself moderating this conversation, where you are in this journey around diversity, equity, and inclusion in your work. And how can we, sort of weave that into the themes that we'll be discussing as a panel. So with that, why don't we jump to the first poll question? And I encourage you to please answer it if you can. Does your organization have a stated diversity goal? Yes or no? It's pretty easy. Okay, so 63% of you have a stated diversity goal, 38% of you do not. Okay, very interesting. All right, let's go to our next question. What is your organization's most pressing need related to the diversity and inclusion space? Please select all that apply. Recruitment and advancement, leadership and culture, strategy, training and communication. Okay, leadership and culture. All right, very good. And then strategy and training and communication, we're just about tied. Recruitment and advancement coming in at 56%. Okay, interesting, but leadership and culture at the top of the list. Okay, and our final question to get to know you all a little bit better in the audience is, how do you think your organization is doing on diversity? Poor, fair, average, or excellent? It'll be interesting to see. Okay. So I would say the majority of you think you're doing average. A few of you are really feel like you're doing excellent at 11%. A few are doing poor, and then so sort of fair and average is where we are. So I think as a collective, we feel like we're sort of at the middle of the pack, which is great because I think that we both, myself included, have a lot to learn going into this panel today. So thank you so much for participating in this poll. I appreciate it. So now I'd like to give you an opportunity. I'd like to meet our panelists. It's a really august panel. Michelle Inness, Angela Fong, and Don Iveson, Mayor Don Iveson. Let me start first by introducing the Edmonton Mayor Don Iveson. Since his election as Edmonton's 35th mayor in 2013, Mayor Iveson has led Edmonton's transformation into a more uplifting, resilient, and globally competitive city. Iveson studied political science at the University of Alberta, then served as president of Canadian University Press in Toronto. He returned home to a city that appeared to be exporting young, smart leaders, thinkers, and creators and entrepreneurs faster than it could attract them. As a proud Edmontonian, the challenge of attracting and retaining more people inspired him to run for city council in 2007. And one of his key goals, both as councillor and mayor, has been to build the kind of city for when the time comes, his children will never want to leave. Thank you for joining us, Mayor Iveson. Next is Angela Fong, Chief Corporate Officer at Aimco. Angela has been with Aimco since 2011. As Chief Corporate Officer, she leads a number of functions as human resources, corporate strategy, business technology, internal communications, and procurement. Angela has over 20 years of executive level experience and holds the ICD Director's designation, serving on the boards of Covenant Health and 2 privately held Edmonton-based organizations. Angela is also a volunteer with the University Alberta Venture Mentoring Service. I want to hear more about that, Angela. And finally, rounding out this panel is the Alberta School of Business Assistant Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Michelle Inness. Dr. Inness is an associate professor of organizational behavior, as well as the director of the School of Business Leadership Certificate Program for undergraduate students. Dr. Inness received her PhD from Queen's University, and her research focuses on topics including workplace aggression, positive organizational behavior, as well as equity, diversity, and inclusion. She has been published in top-tier journals such as the Journal of Applied Psychology and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Thank you all for being here with me today, and I invite you to turn on your cameras and join me on screen. Fantastic. I think I see everybody here. Welcome, welcome panel. So as we start our discussion today, I'd like to, first highlight the theme that the International Women's Day has put out, which is choose to challenge, which I thought when I first saw it is a really provocative tagline, choose to challenge. What are we choosing to challenge? And I think the experiences we bring to that answer very much reflect our personal and professional experiences in our sectors. So I'd like to, maybe starting with you, Angela, get your reflections. When you hear the International Women's Day theme, choose to challenge, what comes to mind to you? What do you look to challenge in the work that you're doing around gender equity?
Well, thank you, Amy, and good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I perhaps had a bit of a different take on the statement of choose to challenge. When I think back to 2020, so much choice in what we had to deal with through COVID was taken away from us for all of the right reasons, but it shaped our year in a way that we will potentially and hopefully never see again. But we lost a lot of choice. Yet inside 2020, we saw such tremendous strength of people choosing to challenge for a different state of play around diversity and equity, with a lot of the events following the George Floyd passing. So I was just struck with such a dichotomy between the two. We have this year of control, yet this year of incredible challenge and support and enablement and rallying for a better and a bigger cause. And somehow, that was my reflection on that statement. It gives me lots of, it just gave me lots of views to really advance and keep the momentum and keep the conversations going that were so appropriate through 2020, to not let go of the opportunity that's before us.
Yeah, no, you bring up a really good point, Angela. I hadn't thought about that dichotomy of choose to challenge during a year when many of us, particularly women, felt like they had so few choices in front of them in terms of how they would advance. So that I appreciate that reflection. Mayor Iveson, your thoughts on the choose to challenge?
Well, thanks, Amy. And it's a privilege to be here with Michelle and with Angela. And thanks also to Nisha. We're incredibly proud of our poet laureate, and you can see why. She challenges us to think bigger. And that's a little bit of what I was reflecting on this and building a bit on what Angela was saying. I think it falls to us now in this time, in this place, in the arc of human history beset by this pandemic, to challenge our sense of what is possible. And it would be very easy to be bowed by this, to be beaten up by this pandemic, to lose hope. And I think we've all had that at some point in the last year. It's been tough for everybody. But I also marvel at what it has unleashed in terms of a sense of urgency to make positive change against the risks and uncertainties that are out there, and the injustices that have been laid bare, racial reckoning that Angela described, and the gender inequities in terms of how this pandemic has impacted women and girls and trans people disproportionately, and that all of those injustices are front and center. And we've actually, the pandemic, that the restrictions on all of our activity, I was talking with my friend Amarjeet Sohi about this. He said his theory is that actually created space for us to have these tough conversations last summer about systemic racism. And I think this International Women's Day and this year, and thinking about a just recovery and an inclusive recovery, should be a time where we challenge our sense of what's possible. And I would just add to that the forces of the public sector and government and collaboration have been unleashed in a way that we haven't seen probably since the Second World War, if not the New Deal before that. And so this is an unprecedented time in our lifetimes where all sectors of public life, corporate and business, civil society and government, are now being faced with unprecedented challenges, but also license to lead and make change. And when I think about what the scientific community, supported by all of those other actors, has achieved, you remember a year ago, people were saying could be 4 years till we have the vaccine. Now we're still fighting over whether we're going to get it in April or June. I'm just marveling at what humanity has accomplished when we set our mind to it. If we bring that same sense of challenge and purpose to gender equality and justice for all people, we can make change in a short amount of time rather than in an intergenerational time scale that we were working on, say, last International Women's Day. So I think we can challenge our sense of what's possible and rise to this moment.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. And I love the phrasing around license to lead, right? Well, how does this opportunity over the last year provide us a license to lead? And what I'm hearing in your comments too, that I appreciate too, is how do you view this period? Not just one of exponential risk, but one of opportunity. And I think that's a good framing as we think about having this conversation today and taking it forward. Michelle, I would love to get your thoughts on how, from your perspective, Choose to Challenge is manifesting for you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Happy International Women's Day. I think that for me, when I think about the Choose to Challenge tagline, which I also love, the question comes up, well, what is it that we need to challenge? And I think that, over the past so many decades, we've done, I think, such a good job of becoming more conversant in our understanding of gender inequity and all forms of inequity. And I think that we can all, kind of speak at a higher level now to these things than we ever could before. And that's a really good thing. But I often kind of think that with all this knowledge, one thing that, and it doesn't worry me about the knowledge itself, but I think one thing that has worried me all along and maybe continues to a certain extent is just our feeling, or sometimes I think that we might feel a little bit complacent about these inequities, or maybe that we take them as givens, like they're taken for granted truths about our society, because it seems as though it's always been the case that women have suffered from being on the losing end of uneven privilege. And I just wouldn't want people to feel like, well, it's always been that way, so it has to be that way moving forward. And I think for me, that's the mindset that I would like to see challenged, and one that I feel like in the past year has been challenged a little bit more because, as others on the panel have said, the pandemic has really, been a raw sort of way for us to discover the vulnerabilities that we do have in society, and sometimes the uneven burdens that women do bear.
Michelle, I think you bring up such a good point around not being complacent with things as we have understood them for so long. I want to stay with this a little bit longer in terms of getting your perspective on the business case for diversity. Sort of, I think there's an assumption that the case has been made and it's open shut and everybody agrees with it and there's complete buy-in, and therefore why haven't we integrated this into all aspects of our work, whether public, private, academic life. And I think the Power Gap article, as many of us probably on this call have seen, that is not the case. So I wonder if you could tease out for us a little bit more about what is the business case for diversity, and maybe your perspective on if it is there, why is it not getting more traction?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The business case has been asked, and I think kind of answered, right? Like, I think that there are very solid business reasons for promoting diversity and supporting diversity, and that comes from a lot of data, a lot of research that is looked at businesses that really do support their diverse people well in terms of cultures of inclusivity and so on. And comparing them to their competitors in their own industries and so on, you do tend to find that businesses that really do support diversity are the ones that tend to be leaders in terms of their innovation and creativity and problem solving, which is perhaps not too surprising. They also tend to outperform in terms of things like revenues and profitability, but they also gain a lot of reputational advantage. People who, once you kind of gained a reputation for being an employer that is supportive of its people, all of its people, no matter who they are or what identities they show up as, they do tend to get more job applicants, more investment. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So yes, there is a very good business case to be made for diversity.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And, maybe jumping to you, Mayor Iveson, with the business case being made, and I know you've done some really innovative programming with the City of Edmonton to sort of increase diversity on the City Council, such as the WAVE program and Opening the Potential program. I just wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more about how you're integrating this, as you said, this case or this research into your day-to-day. You know, how is the city trying to operationalize this good knowledge?
Well, I'll start with the perspective that I've served on 4 different city councils, and over my time, I've served on councils that meet the 30% UN minimum standard for inclusion for women, and I've served on a council with only 1 woman and 12 men. And when things declined over time to that situation where my colleague, Councillor Bev Esslinger, who I co-lead the Women's Initiative with here at City Hall, when she was the only woman on council, we recognized we had a huge issue, not unique to Edmonton. Women's participation in electoral politics has been in decline, and we could do a whole talk about the toxic environment that is contributing to that and the systemic factors and cultural factors behind that. I believe those are shifting, and we've done our part to try to be part of that change through part of the Women's Advocacy Voice of Edmonton is an advisory committee of all women that advises City Council that was meant to ensure that we did get broader perspective. As policy engagement, and they provided really helpful feedback that's really changed our approach to safety on public transit and in public spaces, for example. So we've relied on that voice to support the work of the Women's Initiative and specific policy initiatives. And you can Google WAVE if you want to see more. I could say lots, but the Opening the Potential mentoring program was another initiative where through a variety of different prototypes and attempts to mentor folks. We did some one-on-one programs, and then we did some larger group-based programs, which I think ultimately worked better in terms of leverage and number of candidates. And then in the last election, we saw the number of candidates, female candidates, I think quadruple. And then we saw the number of female councillors double, though we're not celebrating because we went from 1 to 2. But one other thing I would add here is that though there are only 2 women on council, there are more than 2 feminists on council. And so it's very important for men in leadership in all sectors, but particularly in my space, to not just be allies, but be champions and use our power and use our privilege to make positive change for everybody who we work for. Which is not just people who look and identify like I do, who typically have had so much power. And so that's why I've really enjoyed particularly the mentorship work and then watching these incredible strong female leaders step forward. And then I think just based on what we're seeing right now, the pipeline of candidates and talent coming forward for this fall's municipal election at all levels is very, very encouraging. And so I think it then also falls to lift up those candidates and help them and make sure that council benefits from that business case for diversity, because I know that the level of debate on these issues, we had to work very hard to raise it when council didn't have that diversity. It came much more easily, and not just on these issues, but the value of multiple and diverse perspectives culturally and gender wise made for better decision making over time. So I will absolutely testify to the value of that and think we still have more work to do to get back to that minimum 30% goal that the UN requires and that the city through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities subscribes to. So we're committed to trying to achieve that gender parity at the governance level, and we've worked very hard internally at the city as well in our civil service to achieve that at the executive leadership level as well over time. But there's way more work to do here.
No, I appreciate your reference here to male allies as well. We had to those that are listening, we had a C-suite roundtable on Friday, and Catalyst presented some great research, and one of the most sort of compelling pieces of that research during that time was the importance of male allies, and framing the conversation of the issues we're trying to tackle is not women's issues that women need to fix, right? These are issues that are affecting all of us systemically and holistically, and that it's an all hands on deck approach that's needed. So I appreciate that. So Angela, jumping to Aimco, ESG and board diversity is a key focus of your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you're operationalizing it, how you're thinking about this, and then maybe even referencing some of the work we're doing at ILM, which you've been incredibly active in?
Sure, thank you. So I will speak to a few points as Aimco as an investor and how we're contributing to this important conversation with very tangible work. So in 2015, Aimco added gender diversity to one of our ESG focus areas. So what that means that all of our responsible investment activities at our organization contemplate the topic of gender diversity. And by extension, that obviously means to our investee companies and to third-party managers. So it gives us an opportunity as well to have strong impact at the investor table on a voice over exit, meaning we can have very meaningful, productive conversations with investee companies and external managers about the topic of gender and diversity. Some of the very tangible ways that can be demonstrated in a concrete way is on the investment side. For example, we will vote against a nominating committee in the developed markets if there's less than 25% women on a board. So that would be one example where we would extend that responsible investment lens. Also very proactive in engaging with companies that may be exhibiting low levels of diversity or low levels of diversity on the executive team or within the board. Having conversations with publicly traded organizations about their strategy for improving diversity, and just having that strong, proactive, ongoing voice. Another example in 2020 that statistic that I received from the responsible investment team is we did support 89% of director elections globally. In circumstances where we did, at least in 1/3 of those situations, it was where companies failed to broadly demonstrate commitment to gender diversity on the board. So it gave us that opportunity to exercise voice. Amy, to your point about Investor Leadership Network, and you've probably heard me say this before, and I'll perhaps raise it more than once in our conversation, but I do absolutely believe that a collective voice is a much more powerful voice. So to the topic of choosing to challenge, we've seen as investors representing trillions of dollars in many, many organizations through investee companies and third-party managers, the opportunity to take policy decisions, to have a voice, to have a broader demonstration of what can be done, and much more tangible activity associated with that, with the power of all of us working together. We've got, 14 or 15 countries now that are aligned to our mandate collectively. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and continued opportunity to do the same in Alberta, in Canada, where we choose to challenge that this is the one topic, if we choose, that we can work together by collective industry, and the power of whether it's energy or construction, coming together, united on this front, establishing our own benchmarks and our own programs internally, but making broader commitments as a collective audience, a collective industry of this is where we are today, this is where we want to be, and celebrating our successes. I think it's really important that organizations take that collective approach.
No, I appreciate your comments, Angela, here on the power of a collective voice. You're certainly preaching to the choir with me on this. And, just staying with your comments on the proxy voting, I was thinking as you were talking, when the first poll we had was, does your organization have a stated diversity goal? And I think we were 60-30, somewhere in there. I'm wondering from your perspective as an investor, when you're engaging with these companies, when you're having this conversation, does it matter that they have a stated diversity goal? What are you thinking when they don't? Like, how does that play out to you as a, as an investor?
Well, we've got a fabulous team in responsible investing that are having those direct conversations. Obviously, the commitment to policy and documented intent is important, but from my perspective, it's more about the conversation. If you're having the dialogue, if there's genuine commitment and interest in engaging on the topic, how it eventually is documented is critically important, but it's how do you have the conversation and finding the tone and the tenor within the organization of being prepared to put the topic on the table. And I do find, and we've suffered from this even on our own within Aimco, is sometimes you don't want to overthink what the strategy needs to be. You don't need to, it doesn't have to be perfect and right. But what you do need is to start the conversation and continuing to have that dialogue and putting it on the table. Don't wait for the perfect policy. Get the momentum built through dialogue and conversation. That's where the success will ultimately fall.
Yeah, no, we just had a recent conversation with Island colleagues on this, which said, don't let perfect get in the way of the good. When you're starting on this journey, that it is a journey, and that, we have to start somewhere. Michelle, I'm thinking about you when I think about our second poll question. Given your background in organizational culture and creating positive organizational culture, when we ask the question, what is your organization's most pressing need related to the diversity and inclusion space? It overwhelmingly was chosen leadership and culture. So what are your thoughts about, for those that are on this call and listening to this, what can they specifically do? How do you start to improve your leadership and culture? And then I'll go to you in a minute, Mayor Iveson, around maybe what you're doing as well that's addressing this sort of tangibly. So Michelle, to you.
Yeah, making any kind of change to culture is a big endeavor, right? It takes it's sort of a multi-pronged approach that I think really, inevitably it has to start at the top, where you see that leaders in the organization are demonstrating a commitment to EDI, to equity, and really giving voice to that commitment, making sure that it's a conversation that they're having with, managers all down the line, who ideally in turn should be having conversations with the people that they are leading, right? So it becomes, so that diversity and equity and so on becomes, part of the thinking that goes on, right, in one's workplace. So that's part of the shift, but I think that, making those shifts can be aided certainly by, setting some targets with some time frames. I think that it just, helps keep everybody accountable. And to the extent that you're setting, targets around timeframes and so on, it's a good idea to also be collecting some data to actually see, how you're doing, and if inequities are emerging, where. Having that data in front of you can be really telling in terms of, if we're talking about gender diversity, it can be really telling in terms of where women are thriving and then not. And then you can dig in a little bit deeper to, well, what's happening at this stage or in this place where we're not seeing the results that we want to see. But I think that, those are some mechanisms for kind of setting things up, like setting the stage. But I think ultimately, you also have to you have to ensure that your organizations are a safe space for everybody to have a voice. And it could be a voice specifically about inequity or EDI, but it could be a voice in anything, any conversation that you want to have internally, whether it's about your products or services, your work processes, just ensuring that everybody has some space to present their ideas and some security that those ideas will be taken seriously, not dismissed, not stolen, that others will be judicious with them. And I think too, like just, having some advocates for women or BIPOC members of the organization, by members of the most senior and most powerful people in the organization can be hugely helpful. And I think this kind of comes back to the point that there's a real opportunity for allyship here by men, by all people who are senior leaders, to really, start to advocate and help kind of lift up people in those junior levels.
No, I appreciate that. And you're getting to this, which I want to sort of also pivot us to, is this conversation around inclusivity, not in addition to diversity. Like when we talk about it, what's the difference between the two? And you're referencing here about not just having a seat at the table, but actually having your ideas heard and feeling valued. That argument around, an inclusive culture is necessarily diverse, but a diverse culture is not necessarily inclusive. And that's an interesting challenge to all of us as we think about it. So, maybe pivoting here to you, Mayor Iveson, thinking about how do you think about leadership and culture? I mean, clearly you're trying some innovative programming. Michelle was just suggesting I thought that safe space, that you referenced early on in the license to lead. I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, relentless measurement is one, obviously, and through we're fairly unique as municipalities are the most transparent order of government, and we wear our successes, obviously, but we wear our let's call them opportunities for growth and improvement very openly as well. And so we publish our engagement scores, which include reporting on harassment, whether it's from the public, which can be prejudicial or based on somebody's identity. Our frontline workers take a lot of flack from either people who are frustrated with City Hall or people who are in distress and at their lowest moments and needing the help of first responders, say. And so their experiences are measured and reported on qualitatively and quantitatively regularly and publicly disclosed as well. And so that's created good pressure on us to be ever more mindful of the experience of all of our employees. But I want to zoom out just a little bit to say that I think that in terms of a leadership mindset, understanding that our workforce is a source of abundance and not a constraint, and that the removal of barriers, to the earlier point about getting the benefits of diversity, is unlocking all of that value. Because you can have people and you can score well on the sort of representation numbers and still not be getting the best and safe and fulfilling work outcomes for people because of systemic issues in the workplace or systemic issues in society that the workplace doesn't seem to be taking seriously enough. And so the city's made many commitments around gender inclusion, around reconciliation, and more recently around anti-Black racism. And particularly, from the perspective of intersectionality, we have seen this rash of violence against Black Muslim women wearing hijabs in our city, and that is Islamophobia, it's misogyny, and it's anti-Black racism. And you need to understand and layer all of those in thinking about what you're going to do, and the capacity to do that for an organization to come up with policy responses to that, both as an employer of women and of BIPOC people, but also as an organization that provides services to 1 million very diverse people. We need that intersectionality baked into our worldview. And so we've mandated for several years now GBA plus training for all of our senior policymakers and senior leaders in the organization, including City Council, which not everybody, I'm not going to name names, but not everybody was happy about. But I think it's critical that the tone at the top be sophisticated awareness and engagement with these decision-making tools and the ethic behind them in order to breathe life into what could otherwise be lovely equity, diversity, and inclusion documentation and even metrics, but that aren't really being brought to life culturally in terms of commitments from management and growth and awareness and even admission of vulnerability that we don't have all the answers, and also that our thinking has changed over time. You know, my thinking was about the experience of Black, Indigenous, and people of color was so expanded by my work with first the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 6 or 7 years ago. That's this pin. People wonder what it is. It's the honorary witness pin. And that was consciousness raising for me. And then part of the obligation of taking on the honorary witness role was to bear the stories of survivors and also do continual consciousness raising in our organization. We've taken up the same challenge after George Floyd's murder for anti-Black racism, and we've taken up in different ways the challenges around gender parity and gender equity as well as a city. But that clearly has to be said at the top, and I hope those are questions asked of all candidates running in this fall's election.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate you, going deeper into my next question was around intersectionality. And really how, and this is, in the work that I'm doing on a day-to-day, I know we referenced this in our C-suite panel last Friday, was, increasingly different aspects of diversity are getting pitted against each other. Oh, I can't invest in pro-women projects because now I need to be investing in communities of color, and somehow that they would be mutually exclusive. And so how, at least at the ILN, how we think of it as a gender plus strategy. How do we build on the good work we've done on gender and continue to push on that and understand this layered aspects of identity in understanding how we can best support and serve different populations. As you think about this, Angela, I'm wondering how Aimco is thinking about this. You've been leading these conversations in the industry, but also with our work at ILN. I wonder if you can just talk about how you're advancing that internally.
Sure. I've got a couple of examples that are perhaps the most tangible, but I think Mayor Iveson obviously spoke to one of the most important, and that's the tone at the top. And our CEO, Kevin Ubelein, has been fantastic. He's a member of the 30% Club for Canada, and he has said at the outset that our DEI efforts, it's not a people program or a human resources program, if you will. It's an enterprise solution. We've got investors on our DEI management team. We've got risk representation. We've got responsible investing. We've got a full suite. I think that's really critical to maintain. It was interesting. We were talking about some of the training that we wanted to do within the organization, and we were talking about unconscious bias, and a very thoughtful comment came from one of my fellow executive peers that said, sometimes bias is conscious. So why do you call it unconscious bias? So it was a bit of a mindset shift for us. When we talk about it, it's bias awareness. One of the things that I'm quite proud of what we did through 2020 was had very appropriate, relevant, easy to relate to training for the executive team. And then we facilitated and led discussions with the employees. And it was all in the context about just getting the conversation started and having dialogue. I didn't obviously do all of the sessions. All of my other executive peers were a part of it with their team, but I had two conversations with rather large groups of employees, and it was just a fantastic conversation. It was open, it was expressive. People could get all of their views and thoughts on the table, and that was months ago, and the conversation still continues. So that tells me that we left an impact from that perspective. I think the other thing that's really important for us is to really understand your baseline. So we went through a process through the middle part of the year, receiving what we refer to as EDGE certification. So it's an external party that comes in and takes a look at all of your systems and processes and says, here's your health check. Our health check is not as healthy as we wanted it to be, but at least we now have that baseline, and we can start building the programs and bringing the organization along with us, not told, but with us in continuing the conversation. So I think those are three important things that we'll continue to build upon as we continue this conversation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, and the EDGE certification, a number of the island members have been on that journey. Yes. And I think, sort of highlighting on that piece of what measure gets done. And a big part of it is just trying to understand your baseline and where you're at. Michelle, I'm thinking about your comments around measurement and how important it is to daylight our metrics and understand where our organizations are. I think Mayor Iveson, you called it relentless measurement, which is a great way to think about it too. You know, when I was reading the Globe and Mail's Power Gap recently, there was there's a heavy emphasis on pay equity right now, and how do we sort of close that gap? And I'm wondering if you can, speak to that a little bit about, the importance of measurement as it relates to pay equity, and how do we get a little closer to a more equitable future for men and women on the pay equity front?
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes, I don't know, you can look at it as a complex problem or a really simple one. It can be complex in the sense that, there's been a lot of suggestions that there are all kinds of different factors that contribute to pay inequity. But, when you start looking at the actual data, and you try to link data to, what you might consider to be sort of the usual suspects in terms of the reasons why pay inequity exists, it's a tough thing to nail down. And it seems like a lot of the pay inequity that exists is the result of biases. Angela talked about unconscious bias, and it seems like that is at play here to a large extent. So in a way, there's complexities around fixing the unconscious bias and things like that. On the other hand, though, if you're looking at your data and you're kind of saying, well, listen, there are, we've got lots and lots of data that suggest that across, most of our organizations, and not just here in Edmonton, but in Canada, broadly speaking, pay inequity exists, and yet it doesn't coincide with performance on the job. The simple answer is, and this is where I'm saying it can also be it can be a problem with a simple solution, is you just fix it. I mean, at some point you kind of go, okay, maybe enough is enough. Maybe we've sought to justify pay inequity, and yet I don't think we can really do it. At some point we just have to say, you know what, we have to correct this. But we don't know how we're doing unless we collect data, right? Unless we have really good data, and not just at one point in time, because it is certainly important to get baseline, but you want to continue to measure over time to make sure that you are improving in terms of pay equity. To make sure that you're improving, moving in the direction that you want to go, and identifying if you can find areas where you're really falling short in terms of pay equity, that's where you need to pay attention, but you don't know that in the absence of data. And so often it's the case in organizations that you see pay inequity across the board, but it's often really pronounced at those most senior levels of organizations. And so when that's the case, it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, well, we can hone in on that, and we can really try to suss out why that's happening. So I think it's of huge importance.
So, building on that, do you think if there was a regulatory, there was a requirement for disclosure, is that going to get us, is the bottleneck that we're not asking the questions and we're not being forced to actually perform the audit, right? I mean, you're saying it's what's measured gets done. So is it daylighting the information, and therefore how do we create an environment where we are forced to disclose this data? I mean, similar to the UK model, which I know has been, discussed in the Globe article quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the short answer is yes. I think that when we're forced to measure, when we're forced to be accountable, right, for those data, for what we're saying that we're doing, it maybe changes the mindset of decision makers along the way, and it might, when pay is, pay levels are being, compensation packages are being offered, and, promotions are granted, and new rewards come with that. It may be the case that having that accountability gives decision makers some pause to say, okay, well, you know what, as we're going to offer this person a certain level of pay, we really need to be aware of, what have we been offering? What is fair? What is going to be equitable compared to colleagues? Yeah.
Yeah, now oh yes, Mayor Iveson, yes.
Well, I agree with everything that's just been said, but I want to make sure we don't lose an important systemic barrier to equal participation in the workforce, which is inadequate childcare. And it shows up in two ways. One, childcare is very poorly paid work. Which is not fair. So if there's a place where there ought to be some regulation with our most precious resource, which is our kids, then I think, fair pay for that critical work and broad availability of that service on an affordable, high quality basis, because the absence of that system, it exists in parts of this country to some degrees, but compared to other OECD countries who have robust early learning and care networks, we fall behind because women's participation in the workforce is impaired both by that poorly paid work in those settings, but also by the lack of ubiquity of high quality childcare to allow women to work full time in the workforce and build their careers according to the same trajectory that men are typically able to do. So I think one of the most important interventions, we've seen the importance of childcare in this pandemic especially, and there's some great recommendations around this, by the way. I'd highlight the YWCA and the Institute for Gender and the Economy released a feminist economic recovery plan from COVID document that's got very strong policy recommendations, particularly around childcare. So I think that from the abundance mindset I was talking about earlier, creating the opportunity for women to thrive in their careers, for children to get all the advantages early, and for people doing that important work, which is either not valued at all if it's at home in the category of unpaid work, or undervalued in a poorly regulated childcare space. I think a policy intervention there to grow the capacity for childcare would make a huge dent in the gender equality and pay gap. And the City of Edmonton is very supportive of that as part of our anti-poverty work and for our own workforce as well, making sure that there's childcare spaces proximate and available for our employees in our workplaces. But that needs to be a societal level shift that I think would make a huge dent, in addition to what Michelle was just saying.
Yeah, I know it's a great point in creating that enabling environment. Angela, you want to jump in?
Just very briefly, I want to pile on to the great comments that Michelle and Mayor Iveson have already mentioned. When I think about the matter of compensation as it's closer to home within organizations, I think that the posting of comp and disclosing, that's the outcome. It's the inputs. What's the compensation policy and philosophy? I think that's something that organizations should be prepared to speak to and be prepared to be quite transparent about. If you're building the right system that has gender agnostic on the evaluation of jobs and the pay policy, all of that should ultimately come with pay equity. Other things I think organizations should be doing, particularly large size organizations where there's lots of data to work with. But for example, when we all get our performance reviews every year, we now have an overlay of a diagnostic that when we look at the performance review outcome of all 500 plus employees in the organization, we go into the data and say, did women receive higher performance scores than men or vice versa? We started looking at that kind of information much more closely than we ever have in the past. And it's really enlightening. It speaks to compensation philosophy and policy that is really the driving force to those pay disclosure outcomes and the right outcome.
It's interesting. So in your sense, asking the questions, right? And not being afraid of the answers and figuring out how do you respond.
Yeah, and dissecting the information differently than just pay and pay.
Right,
yeah.
right. Trying to figure out as you said, what are the inputs that are taking us to that point?
Right.
Thinking it through. Well, this has been fantastic. And now I think it's about time to open it up to some questions that have come in from the audience. And I'm going to read them out and then maybe just raise your hand if you want to take it, either Mayor, Angela, or Michelle, but we'll start here. It says, can we hear from panelists what kind of pay gap data is being looked at and how that is informing decisions at each organization represented by the panelists? So some of you have addressed this a little bit, but maybe, you know, a question, I'm sorry, move that over. A question to be able to, you know, anyone want to take that on? What's the data? Yeah.
Well, you know, looking at, I guess, universities, and I think that, I actually think that universities are very similar to many, many organizations in terms of what I'm about to say. But at universities, there have been quite a few audits around pay equity over the last several years. And there have also been, there's also been, you know, examinations of how women and men are faring in terms of promotion to different ranks in the university. And it seems like where, I mean, there are pay differences at every rank within the university amongst faculty members, but it's particularly pronounced at that highest level, at the rank of full professor. And it also happens to be the case that there are fewer women full professors than there are men full professors. So, and that's pretty much across the board, across Canadian universities. So yes, you know, I think it's something that has been looked at, and universities are attempting to respond to in different ways, right? But I think that in terms of responding to those pay gaps, I believe that university administrators are more keenly aware that this is a problem and are working towards correcting it, right, over time. And in terms of just kind of that representation at the highest sort of rank, at that full professor rank, you know, that is a bit of a trickier problem to navigate, actually. And I think that probably the reason why it's tricky to navigate is, you know, something that, you know, I was saying earlier and some other panelists were saying that it seems to be really this kind of unconscious bias rather than, you know, explicit conscious sexism that's at play, but rather, you know, just getting promoted to full professor is something that where the criteria are really kind of squishy and it can be challenging for somebody applying for full professor and also for committees evaluating to really know, you know, to really have a sense of what the criteria are, right? And it tends to invite a lot of subjectivity and therefore a lot of bias. And it seems like that might be what's playing a role there.
Oh, interesting. And I want to come back to it because we have another question about academia, but second question. Oh, yes, Mayor Iveson.
Well, yeah, I was just busily trying to see what I could pull up here in terms of what's reported. You know, the city of Edmonton has 73 different lines of business and then an administrative and political governance structure over top of that. And I think the answer is for us is complex because it varies between those different areas. The fire service, for example, really torques the overall numbers, rightly or wrongly. And we are working very hard to increase gender diversity and cultural diversity in the fire service as the requirements evolve for that work. But some of those areas that are traditionally and even still more associated with men, outdoor labor, for example, there are gender inequities in some of those 73 lines of business. In others, it's the other way. But at the leadership level, at our branch managers and our deputy city managers and executive leadership team level, we've worked very hard to achieve parity in terms of number of folks, and then the comp rates are are comparable across all of those. So I don't have breakdown data, but this has provoked a question for me to go back and look at that. But across the whole organization, to be fair, there is a gap because of some of those large sectors that are traditionally overrepresented by men, and our challenge there, fortunately for those areas that are unionized, labor provides for equalization, those seniorities still, even as you work through intergenerational change towards inclusion, even seniority itself still fundamentally perpetuates that gap over time. So we're not where we need to be on that. I don't have the specific numbers, but I am going to follow up on them based on the question.
No, great. Thank you so much. And then we have a couple questions here that are on the well-documented inflection point around the unpaid caregiving that has reached a fever pitch during COVID, particularly for women. So one is first, what can organizations do to encourage new fathers to take significant time off, 6 months or more? We've seen a lot of pressure and encouragement for women to do that, but how can we encourage men? I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on what you've seen, either through academia or even at Aimco or through the city, if you'd have any perspectives on that.
I can jump in just very briefly, Amy, on some work that that we did in 2020. We asked the Aimco team what elements of our total compensation or benefits program would they like to see us pay more attention. And it was interesting when we took the data back, and we had tremendous response rates, so it was very indicative of how people were feeling. But we got a lot of data back that said, we're all at different stages of our life. So what is it that you can do to help us with more of the life stages within the organization? So whether it be I'm fresh out of university and I've got lots of student debt, or I'm mid-career, but I'm starting a family, or I'm starting to track on retirement, but I don't want to just be here one day and gone the next. So how do we take advantage of all the knowledge that's coming out the door? So we really built a program of what we refer to as the stages of life. I can't take credit for it. It was some folks on the HR team that did this. But I think it enabled us to have a broader conversation about where you are generically. It doesn't matter if male, female, where you're at in your stage of life. And then we were able to build programs that corresponded to that. So it's not a one broad sweeping statement that is intended to help everybody. But if for example, with folks that are starting families, just simply enhancing where we were on our leave program and promoting it as stage of life, regardless of who you are, same sex, male, female, doesn't matter. Here's the leave provision. Let's be proud of it. Let's shout it off our rooftops. It's going in the right direction. I think that was one thing that I think really helped us, just profiling the importance that everyone needs leave and wants to take an appropriate leave for their families. So how does it, as an organization, did we need to do a little bit better than not having more of the traditional thinking about that? So
yeah, no, that's great. I did not know about the stages of life. That's a great framing. That sort of elevates it and kind of broadens the tent for the conversation. A follow-up on this kind of COVID caregiving time. One of the panelists asked, what are the panelists' views on addressing how COVID and work from home and children at home instead of school is disproportionately affecting women, and they've had to leave the workforce? How do we get back on track? And this, I think this is going to be one of the most pressing issues that we'll be thinking about from a public and private perspective over the next stretch. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it collectively. So I don't know who would like to go first.
Maybe if I might, just, I think to the previous question, normalizing paternity leave is critical. It wasn't an option when I was a city councillor when I had my kids, but I'm really proud of some of the work that Edmonton City Council did to put in place the first paternity leave policy for elected officials at the municipal level of any big Canadian city. Now, no one's used it yet, but it's there, and when it does get used, it will help to normalize that. And it's very, very much for any gender expression. So for fathers and for mothers, I think the other point I was going to make that straddles both questions is around flexible work. I think, you know, it's not just the paternity leave or the bereavement leaves or the other sort of big life stages, which are critical and employers need to be thoughtful around, but it's the micro leave, maybe, is one way of thinking about it, that a flexible work week. I mean, it has been incredibly disruptive in a lot of ways, but the flexibility that COVID and work from home has afforded me to actually see my kids and interact with them differently as a parent has been wonderful. And I think that's something I don't want to lose, and want to make sure that, you know, as an employer, the city is doing a lot of thinking about how we can be more flexible with our workforce going forward, even as they come back into the office or conventional workplace some days a week. We've seen that this flexibility can be really, really beneficial. And it's what women and parents have been asking for years, and employers have been really resistant for various reasons in the past. And I hope that COVID will give us much more space to give people that flexibility, so that people with caregiver responsibilities, people with aging parents who need tests and struggling with health issues, whatever the stage of life is, that flexibility is there to be more family friendly. And that's going to be necessary to getting people, particularly women who've been impacted the way you described, back into the workforce in a way that accommodates them and their family needs. And that goes for young dads and young moms.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for just normalizing taking a paternity leave or a parental leave, right? And making that an okay thing to do will be great for both men and women. I think just in terms of childcare responsibilities. But I just wanted to make an added point to that I think that one thing, you know, I've certainly noticed in my work, which is done entirely remotely, is that, you know, a lot of professionals are, you know, very, you know, apparently balancing work and family because their children are there with them in Zoom meetings. And I have to say that whereas I've seen more women than men have, you know, sort of have their children next to them during a meeting or something like that, there are men who are doing that too. And I think that there's something normalizing about that as well. Just having sort of this, you know, we all have this glimpse into each other's home lives, and being able to see dads, you know, sort of take on, do the parenting, or even, you know, very explicitly say, you know, I'm parenting while I'm meeting. So just so you know, there might be some interruptions is important to that, right? Important to normalizing parenting for both men and women. And then I would say also to the point of just, you know, yes, I think the pandemic has been very brutal for women, and a lot of women have lost employment. And, you know, I'm just thinking, I mean, I think we're all trying to puzzle out what that's going to mean, you know, in the coming months, years, as things start to normalize again and people start to go back to work. Will those jobs be available if jobs were lost? And in terms of the long-term unemployment of women, what does that mean? And, you know, I just like to say that there is some opportunity, although granted it's longer term, but there is some opportunity here to maybe think about how those people who've lost their employment could be retrained in ways that move our economy forward in the years to come in growing industries and so on.
Brought my kids on the news the other day, and they really wanted to show the dog off to everyone watching CTV last week before the budget. So I'm trying to do that.
Very nice.
I love it. And it actually
got good ratings off it.
Yeah.
Your points remind me of a comment Kevin made on at the panel last Friday, where he talked about the humanity that comes from some of these experiences of being in Zoom meetings and seeing a little window into someone's life, and that, you know, it's not necessarily always a negative, right? It's a positive to see them play these different roles and wear these different hats. just a couple more questions, as I know our time is getting short. One is quite interesting around this male ally conversation. It says, many men see efforts to empower women as a personal attack on their privilege. Is there an effective strategy that you've encountered for dealing with this? How do we, how do we tackle this? How do we bring more men into the fold for this conversation?
Amy, maybe I'll jump in quickly. I think that we all know intuitively, statistically, diversity creates a better outcome. And the more organizations can start with that conversation first and reinforcing and talking about evidence of where we've seen diversity create a better outcome, whether it's in an investment decision or a corporate decision. If you start at that very high level philosophy and really engage in a meaningful way for a long period of time about diversity equals something better, it's easier then to have the conversations about, now where might we need to spend particular time to ensure that we can continue to embrace and evolve the diversity numbers that we want within an organization. If the first time out of the gate conversations are talking about, here's an unrepresented group and we want to get the numbers up, I think that's starting in not overly effective place to start.
Right. Good. Good. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Mayor?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I'm charting my reactions because my first reaction is, dude, get over yourself. But that's a judgment, right? And so if people will sense that judgment and then have a defensive response to it. And so if people are feeling judged, it's natural. And I've had to do lots of work on this, lots and lots of therapy, lots of meditation to get to the point where I can see that reaction and then have empathy for the fact that some men are at that stage where they're having a defensive reaction to the conversation. And so it's hard to summon empathy for that when justice is at stake, but if you want to convert people, you got to meet them where they are. And then the next argument is usually, dude, you have daughters, don't you want a better world for them? And I've made that argument, and I feel that in my heart of hearts because my daughter Alice, who you just met there, I don't want to wait 7 generations for gender equality. I want her to have it, but it is literally a paternalistic argument to appeal to a man's sense of concern for the safety of his own family members when there is a broader question of justice, which is really what's at stake here, which is to tolerate, and this is back to an abundance and let's empower everyone versus a constraint. We're fighting over limited resources and we're fighting over limited opportunity. Somebody, Eula Biss, is a very thoughtful writer mostly on race, but also on gender. And she describes privilege as opportunity hoarding. And so it was really helpful for me to have the idea of privilege used well is spreading opportunity to create multiplicity and abundance. Privilege done badly is hoarding it for yourself and claiming that it's not your fault. But if you're continuing to hoard it and not a champion for opening up privilege and opportunity for everybody, then on some level, and this is really hard, and I've had to contend with this, if you are hoarding your own privilege and making an argument for it, then you are perpetuating systemic inequality, whether it's racial, whether it's gender, whether it's other injustice or discrimination. And that is fundamentally a form of violence. And so when people are calling out for structural and systemic change against anti-Black racism or Islamophobia or gender equality or trans rights, it is because privilege is not being opened up and shared equally and abundantly with everyone. And if we did that, and this is the real mindset shift, if we really did that, we would all be better off. And we could tackle so much bigger challenges. So I mean, I think it's a journey, and it requires a lot of self-awareness, and not everybody's in the same place. But this is where leadership is required to choose to challenge these tough conversations and make space safe for that kind of reflection, and then sharing resources like so Krista Tippett's podcast on being is just a great resource generally on many of these questions, but her interview with Eula Biss I strongly recommend to people who are thinking about these questions, because resources like that, when you're not on the defensive but your heart is open to deep questions of inclusion and fairness, which can only be kind of grappled with at the soul level. Like, so you can't shame someone into changing these things. It is ultimately hearts and minds, but there are so many good resources, and the level of debate is rising so fast. And I'm just grateful for a space like this to continue raising the level of debate on these issues for men and for everyone.
Oh, I couldn't agree anymore. And I second that vote for podcasts on being, because I also love it. You know, in closing, that was a great, a bit of a summary, Mayor, but in closing, I would like to give the three of you the last word in terms of just a call to action. For those that are on this call, for everyone who is listening, we've covered a lot of territory. We've talked about the tone at the top matters, that this COVID period has given us both opportunities in addition to risks. We have a license to lead. What measured gets done. These are some of the themes I heard, but I would like you to give the audience sort of one, call to action that they should take forward on International Women's Day and every day to build a world that is more equitable and just. So I'll start with you, Michelle.
I guess I was just thinking about this in relation to the very last part of our conversation. I thought my colleagues on the panel were speaking very, very well to the issue around men and the loss of privilege, or the perceived loss of privilege. And I just would want to to add to that a comment that, whereas I'm sure there are many people who do fear the loss of privilege, but there are many, many people as well who actually really want to promote equity. And I would say that's true of men and women, people of all genders. And, and I would just kind of say that if you're one of those people, regardless of your gender, that it could be really important work for you to do to be an ally, to really advocate for others in the organization, maybe more junior women in the organization. And I would call on people of all genders to take that up if that's where their mind is at.
All right, great, Michelle. I just got that we're almost at time. So Angela and Mayor Iveson, you have 10 seconds each. All right,
I would
Angela.
say choose to challenge within your industry to ensure that your voice is as big as possible. This is an easy topic for us to all work together and look around to your peer organizations and create a partnership on this topic.
Oh, wonderful. Mayor Iveson.
I yield the last word to my esteemed panel colleagues, and making space for allies, or making space for champions and leaders, is the thing we can do. So I yield to them.
Thank you all so much. This was such a rich conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else